I'm Gleaves Whitney. I direct the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley State University, and I am very happy to see you at this very special event. It's special in the first place because we have a number of graduating seniors, people moving on from the Cook Leadership Academy, and we are so proud of them. Let's give them a hand. The second reason this evening is particularly special is that we have an outstanding speaker, a commencement speaker, as it were, a speaker from whom you're going to learn a lot. You're going to be really treated. This is going to be something that blows your mind, I think, after you hear what happens in here and walk out of these doors. And I'm raising expectations. He's starting to get nervous, but no, he will really, I think, expand your perspective. And the third reason this evening is so special is that, this is the 10th anniversary that we had a wonderful gift from the Hauenstein family and from the Cook family. That's why it's called the Peter Cook Leadership Academy. And they gave us the money to start an endowment for the Cook Leadership Academy. And we're celebrating 10 years, and so I want to give a hand to the families who are representing those two entities. Thank you so much for your support. And now I'd like to introduce Scott St. Louis, who's the program manager for the Common Ground Initiative here at Grand Valley State University's Hauenstein Center. Scott.
Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening. It is wonderful to see our fellows here today with friends and family alike as we all come together to celebrate your graduation from the Cook Leadership Academy. As Gleaves said, my name is Scott St. Louis, and I serve as the program manager for the Hauenstein Center here at Grand Valley State. And it's my privilege briefly to introduce our speaker for this evening. Robert Quinn's life mission is to inspire positive change. He spent the last 40 years doing research, publishing, teaching, consulting, and speaking to more than half of the Fortune 500. A professor emeritus at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, he is one of the co-founders of the Center for Positive Organizations. Professor Quinn's research and teaching interests focus on leadership, organizational change, and effectiveness. He's published 18 books on these subjects, and his best-selling book, Deep Change, has sold over 100,000 copies. A fellow of the Academy of Management and the World Business Academy, his latest book is The Positive Organization, Breaking Free of Conventional Cultures, Constraints, and Beliefs. Please help me welcome Robert Quinn to Grand Rapids.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. I earlier in the day was talking to these folks, and I said, every time I drive into the city, I feel a tangible sense of community. It's just an amazing place, and it's great to be with you. Here's what I'd like to do tonight. I'd like to talk about what we can't create, why we can't create it. I'd like to talk about something called the positive lens, and then share with you a concept that I think is a little unusual and that you may find valuable, hopefully tonight, in terms of applying. I'll share 4 tools, and if we have some time, we'll do some question and answers. So that's our roadmap together. Henry Ford. He said, if I'd asked the customer, he would have said, give me a faster horse. I love this sentence. Because what he's saying is, you and I think incrementally. If we ride around on a horse, then we say, well, make my horse a little faster. And Henry's thinking about something entirely different. He's thinking about an automobile, but I can't ask for an automobile. I think that applies to every one of us all the time, and it has some really large implications. So the question is, what are some of the things we can't imagine that if we did might make a difference? I was at a major company. This very quiet woman spoke up. She said, we have 1,600 executives. When I look at them, I see them falling into 3 groups. Group number 1 is very tiny. And group number one are the leaders. I know they're leaders because when I meet them, I want to be like them. What an interesting definition. Sounds very homely. She said the second group is very, very large. It's made up of managers. Intellectually, they understand leadership. They just don't practice it. And then there's this tiny little group. They're technicians, and they're always going to be technicians, and they're never going to understand leadership. What captured me when I listened to her say that is that it was as if she crystallized 40 years of experience. In almost every organization I go in, I find exactly what she described. And the huge question is, why is the middle group so big? Why do we have so many people getting executive pay and they're managers instead of leaders? It's really a fascinating question to think about. Tonight, I want to draw from the last 15 years of experience, which has been for me absolutely exhilarating. About 16 years ago, two of my colleagues and I took a big risk. We called a conference. We brought in about 100 scholars. And we said, it's time to revolutionize our field. And they kind of laughed at us. And we said, here's what we have in mind. If you look at this picture up here, social scientists study topic X. They go out, they get a random sample of responses. They analyze those very rigorously, and they come back and they say, here are the patterns that come out of our statistical analysis. This is what is. And they all nodded head. They said, of course, that's what we do. We said, you know, we think there's a bias in that process. They said, what possible bias could they be? We said, the bias is called central tendency. It's that vertical line in the middle. That is, when we're doing that, we're describing convention, what generally happens. They said, of course, that's what we want to do. We said, well, we think it may be time to move our focus from the middle of that curve to the very far end of that curve, where excellence lives. We think we should ask different questions. If we look at an individual, what does this person look like at his or her very best? Not what do they normally look like, but what do they look like at their best? If we have a team and we study it, what does that team look like at its very best? If you study an organization, what does the organization look like at its very best? You apply the same scientific methods, but you're asking a different question. Now, that was 15 years ago. A lot of people laughed. Some people took us seriously, and gradually a network of 300 or 400 scholars grew. And over the last 15 years, we have had much science published from the far end of that curve. For me, the last 15 years have been the most exciting of my career. I wished we had done this 40 years ago, because the findings are so provocative in terms of application. When you have data about excellence, you begin to understand some pattern. It immediately has implications about things that we might do. If you look at this curve, at this picture, it also helps us to understand a bias that we all carry around. That is, we know scientifically that negative is stronger than positive in terms of holding human attention. I may be giving the most interesting lecture in the world, and a bomb goes off in the hallway. I stand here and continue to lecture. But not a single person's listening, right? Because you're all paying attention to that explosion and asking yourself, what's going on here? What's the threat? Do I have to run? Negative drives out positive in terms of holding attention. That's actually a very good thing because it promotes survival. And we've carried that for a very long time. it also discourages flourishing. If we don't examine excellence, it's much harder for you and I to flourish. And some people believe the purpose of life is survival. I'd like to suggest the purpose of life is flourishing. Survival is necessary to that flourishing, but that's a very different perspective. What we find is that when you go to the far left of that curve where things begin to break down, there's a new dynamic that emerges. It's called a vicious cycle. You do whatever it was that made you successful in a vicious cycle, and it makes things not better, it makes them worse. And you say, whoa, how do I make sense of that? And you just do more of what you've been doing, and it keeps getting worse. And you can't get out of it. That's what a vicious cycle is about. On the other side is the same dynamic turned upside down. There we find virtuous cycles, where we have synergy, where things reinforce each other. And what happens is you get emergent dynamics. New things emerge from the tensions that exist. And those things are very different than the things in the middle. And they take us to excellence. Now, as we look across all the findings and all the studies that have been done in the last 15 years, something became very apparent. This is a very troublesome list that I have up here, and if you read through it, you might ask yourself, what is that list? And someone might say, that's a very negative view. Would you feel insulted if I said, this is what you believe? Nod your heads. You would be insulted. Now, this is what you believe. Now I'm in big trouble because I have to convince you something you absolutely don't believe. You're on the playground, you're 3 years old. Someone says, let's play Army. You raise your hand and you say, I'll be the private. Is that what you said? No, you say, I'll be the general, I'll be the mother, I'll be the father. You're 3 years old and you know it's better to be on top of a hierarchy than on the bottom. On Sunday afternoons, my son would bring over his children for dinner. There were 3 little girls. The mother would put food on the plate every Sunday, and in unison, like a dance, these little girls would say, oh, yuck. It didn't matter what it was, oh, yuck. And the mother would go berserk. And then she'd say, you like strawberry shortcake, don't you? And they say, yes, we do. She says, you have to eat 8 bites or you get no strawberry shortcake. Now, what do we call that? No, not bribery, that's negotiation. That's business, right? That's a transaction. From the time you and I learn to talk, we internalize assumptions about transaction and exchange and contract, about hierarchy, about authority, and we carry those around. This list comes from social science. They may have done hundreds of thousands of studies, and they come back and they say, this is what people look like. You say, how could that be? Why are they so sick? Well, they study you and I. The first 3 assumptions of economics. People are rational, self-interested actors. Resources are scarce. Conflict is inevitable. Right? This is economics. It's a very gloomy picture of the world. Now, an interesting thing about that is if there's any truth whatsoever in that, if I believe these things and I'm managing people, what would I do? Now it's clear I can't trust the people, so I have to build a control system. Now you know what you do when you build a control system? You know what the people do? They find ways to blow up your control system. They resist. And you know what that is? That's data. That data says my theory is true. So I have to build a better control system. That's a self-sealing logic that goes on. And our organizations across this planet look pretty much alike. Now here is another view. It's a very, very different view. And I ask people, what is this list? And they say, oh, that's Pollyanna. And what they mean is, that's unrealistic. Now, a minute ago, they were insulted because I told them they believe this. Now they're defending this and saying this is unrealistic. When we take the positive lens and we go look at something like an organization, this is what we find. What that means is the first list is real. The second list is real. How can that be? And the answer is time. In any given organization, there's rhythm. And most of the time, it tends to drift towards that list. But at other times, often when it's at its best, it starts to look like the list on the right. And the question is, how do you turn an organization that looks like that into an organization that looks like that? And there are two answers. Number one is crisis. I had a senior government leader say to me, the happiest day of my professional life was 9/12. I said, what are you talking about? He said, the day after 9/11, I didn't have a single bureaucrat working for me. I only had Americans willing to do anything. In crisis, we often see the best of the human effort. The other way to make this happen is called leadership. Not management. Leadership. We make those things equal. He's our CEO, he's our leader. She's our division chief, she's our leader. What I'm saying when I utter that sentence is leadership is position. I'd suggest there are some CEOs who are not leaders. That's kind of radical. Well, what I'd like to do tonight is to take the positive lens and I'd like to shine it on something. I have a number of extreme claims I'm going to make tonight. One is, when you take the positive lens and you shine it on anything, the thing transforms. So tonight, I'm going to transform it on a word that you use all the time, and the word is leadership. And what's going to come out of that is a radically different picture of something we feel very familiar with. Okay? That's our objective tonight, is to see the world differently by the time we leave. And for that thing to be very practical, to have implications for action tonight. Now, that's a big, tall order. That's even a bigger expectation than we got at the beginning. So hold me accountable to that big claim, and we'll see how we do. Entrepreneur, he goes to the venture capitalist and he says, I've got a great idea, give me money. They say to him, this is a great idea. You go home, take out a second mortgage, come back and see us. So he does. 12 months later, he's bankrupt. It didn't work. Now, you've committed your entire soul to something. You've gone out and begged for money. They gave it to you. You've hired people, said you can feed your family, and now you can't make payroll. You are a failure. What's that feel like? That's pretty horrible. I designed my life to never have that feeling. Well, as you can see, he was pretty down. But he didn't stop there. He made another statement. I'm going to show you this next statement that he finished, and I'm going to ask you to read it rather than read it to you. And as you do, pick out the sentence that you think is most important. Okay? All right, here's his comment. Read it, pick out your sentence you think is most important. I think I gave you a hard task. You know, you can do it, but it's a hard task because there's so many powerful sentences up there. This man's describing something that is really, really important. I want to show you some science. Post-traumatic growth. That means after a big crisis in my life, someone died, I lost my job, my house burned down, those things happen to us. For the graduates tonight, they're going to happen. That's a horrible thing to tell a graduating class. It's actually a wonderful thing. They're going to happen. The question is, how will I respond to them when they happen? Because we know, again, there are two choices, fight or flight. I can get bitter or I can get in the fetal position, and those are both bad responses. There is a third way. I can choose to grow. Well, there's now much research on this. What I'm going to show you is not a study, it's a literature review from many, many studies, so pretty stable patterns. When someone goes through a trauma, crisis, and afterwards they start to grow, what results follow? Well, here's what they have, the research says. Renewed sense of priority, deeper sense of meaning, increased self-confidence, a shift out of the victim mentality. That one's really important because our organizations are filled with armies of people living in the victim mentality. Everywhere we go. In fact, I can be sitting in my living room, reading a novel, minding my own business, and this woman walks in, and she says, "Take out the trash." I can't believe it, right? I go into the victim mentality. If someone cuts you off on the way home tonight in your lane, you'll go into the victim mentality, right? We fly into the victim mentality. That's a big deal. Increased self-reliance. Closer ties with people. That's an interesting statement. Increased self-disclosure. I think this is huge. Here's who I really am. Take a look. That's a big deal. Emotional expressiveness, compassion, generosity, increased sense of mortality and vulnerability. I now want to show you a second piece of science. Again, a literature review on a topic we used to not talk about in public. But now the psychologists study this stuff. Spiritual experiences. What happens to someone after they have a spiritual experience? Here's the findings. Increased sense of purpose, tendency to pursue desired results. Alignment of emotions, values, and behaviors, increased courage and resolve. Increased sense of union and harmony, a self-transcendence, something, I'm connected to something bigger than myself. Selfless contribution, communication of my truest feelings. Increased sense of capacity to live, develop, and endure. Feelings of hope and optimism, a tendency towards visioning, experimenting, discovering, and creating. Now, I put them on those boxes because the words are different, but they're basically saying the same thing. So that raises a very interesting question. Post-traumatic growth, spiritual experiences. If they have similar outcomes, what do they have in common? At first, that seems like a hard question. Well, one thing they have in common is discontinuity. If I suddenly have a dramatic spiritual experience, I wasn't expecting that. If I suddenly have my house burned down. These are discontinuities, and what they share is they force me to ask fundamental questions about my identity and my destiny. Who am I? If I have no house or no spouse or no job, who am I? If I've had some profound spiritual experience, what does it mean about my identity? Who am I now? And when I ask those kinds of questions, I'm doing something called value and purpose clarification. Whenever you're depressed, if you go to a psychologist, no matter what therapy they use, there's one common denominator across all the therapies. Value clarification. The moment you clarify your value and your identity, you stand up, you say, okay, I'm ready to go. the depression starts to leave, right? All right, let me get down to some key notions. First, I want to introduce myself to you. Would you like to meet me? Whew, thank you. Here's Bob Quinn. Number one, I am comfort-centered. If you ask me to help you and it's in my skill set, I usually say yes. If you ask me to help you and it's outside my skill set, I get slippery because I don't want to be embarrassed, right? I really like my comfort zone. Two, I tend to be externally directed. I worry about what people think of me. What would the boss say? What would my neighbors say? Turns out this is so pervasive that we find all over the world people give away their internal locus of control. And they become controlled by what they imagine other people think. So I try to be all things to all people. And I don't know who I am. Turns out that happens with some frequency. I also tend to be self-focused. I worry a lot about me. And then finally, I tend to be internally closed. Science says feedback is the breakfast of champions. You want to grow? Get feedback. I say, okay, I believe in science. So I say, tell me something. How am I doing? Give me some feedback. Now freeze for a minute. Just look at this picture. What am I really asking you? I'm asking you to tell me how you like me, right? Please give me feedback, right? My words are saying one thing. My body's telling you the truth. I don't want feedback. Feedback's scary. What if you ask me to do something that's outside my comfort zone, which it always is? Well, those are four incredibly natural conditions. Everybody tends to drift towards those things. Now, here's the key concept for the night. Fundamental state of leadership. I want to start with the three words at the top and I want to work backwards. Last word, leadership. As I said earlier, most of the time we carry around a shared definition of that word. He's our CEO, he's our leader. We equate it to hierarchy, to position, formal authority. When we do that, we're making some implicit assumptions. One, it's about position. Two, there's one leader. If he's the leader, that means I'm non-leader. I'm something other than leader, usually means follower. There's a whole bunch of assumptions associated with that sentence, and they have dramatic implications. We're going to throw that out tonight. For the rest of this night, leadership is not position, it's influence. Now, who has influence? Everybody. The janitor has influence. Everybody has influence. Not only that, influence is a living system. If we're sitting in a room and everyone's quiet and suddenly someone raises their hand and they make a profound statement, their influence just went from 0 to 10. If they go quiet for a few minutes and do it again, it goes to 10. And pretty soon we can track that pattern. It looks like this. It looks like an EKG. When we gather in a system, there's a living system in that room called influence. It's dynamic. It goes up, it goes down. For each person, it goes up and it goes down. That's a very different way to see it, and hence the middle word, state. We're not interested in traits. If I said to you, to be a leader, you need to be tall, strong, and male, what would you tell me? She's not buying that. We normally talk about traits. Tonight, we're not talking about traits, we're talking about a state. A state is a dynamic thing that looks like the EKG. It's moving, it's dynamic, it's alive. And finally, fundamental, the foundation, the starting point upon which it's based. Now, if you look at this diagram, I can go from being comfort-centered to being purpose-centered, focused on some very important result. I can go from being externally directed to being internally directed. I can operate from my truest values. I can become authentic. Another word for that is integrity. That's a very interesting word. Organizations tend to undermine integrity because we become inauthentic. I can become other-focused, and I can become externally open. When we make those 4 shifts, our influence skyrockets because we deviate from the norm. We become positive deviants. Some people can't process that statement. Deviance is inherently negative, right? It's on the left side of the curve. But when you go to excellence, that's deviance from the norm. Excellence, by definition, is deviance from the norm. When you embrace excellence, you are a positive deviant. When you're a deviant, people have to pay attention. They may choose to shoot you, but they have to pay attention because you are a discontinuity. I want to go through each dimension. I have a friend who is a professional sports psychologist, one of the top in the world, and every one of his clients is an elite professional athlete. You would know all his clients. They come to him when they're stuck. She came when she was stuck at number 10. She could not move. When they arrive at his facility in Orlando, Florida, every single athlete that walks in, he asks them the exact same question. What is your life mission? They usually go into shock. Then they say, I want to be number 1. And he says, I'm sorry, that is not a life mission. And they get very frustrated. About half of them say, I want to make a lot of money. He says, I'm sorry, that's not a life mission either. A life mission is your contribution. What are you going to give to this world? What's uniquely you? When you leave the planet, how will it be different because of what you gave? What is your life mission? You have until 8:30 tomorrow morning to come up with it, or I won't work with you. They cannot believe their ears. She was furious. She stomped out. At 8 o'clock the next morning, she's banging on his door. She said, what is it? She said, I found it. I found my life mission. He says, that's wonderful. What is it? She said, can't tell you. You'll laugh at me. He says, no, I promise. Tell me, I won't laugh. He said, okay, here it is. I want to be sunshine. You want to be what? I want to be sunshine. I want to bring light, happiness, positive energy to everyone who sees me play and the people I meet. Can you do that best when you win or lose? She went from number 10 to number 1. Now, that's just a feel-good story unless there's a scientific mechanism under that story. And it turns out there is. Everybody in this room has a positivity ratio. Most of us, most of the time, are at 2 to 1. For every negative feeling or thought, we tend to have 2 positives, and that's an equilibrium where most of us stay. If it changes, we change. For example, if you go to between 4 and 5 to 1, there's a physiological change that takes place in every one of us. We begin to pump in our brain oxytocin. When that happens, our consciousness expands. We see a bigger picture. The stress goes down. Not only that, we're able to associate unlike things, to integrate differentiation. Another word for that is creativity or innovation. We're able to learn at an accelerated rate. That story has a scientific base to it. When you and I learn to consciously elevate our positivity ratio, when we choose to do that, we change how we perform. The world then reacts to us differently. We live in a different world. Business example. I teach an executive course called Leading Change, and one time this company president showed up, and he said on Wednesday, can we have lunch? I said, sure. We're walking down the lunchroom. He said, I know everything there is to know about leading change. I said, okay, why are you here? He said, well, we have 5 companies. I've turned around 2 of the companies. I'm the star. I'm the fair-haired boy. So they called me. He said, one of our companies is the big company that makes all the money. They said, the person that's running this is leaving in 18 months. You're it. You've earned it. You deserve it. But they're leaving in 18 months. We've got this other company. They're already dead. They just don't know it. We want you to go there for 18 months and hold the funeral. Response, I'll take it, with enthusiasm. What's he thinking? Another turnaround. That's what I do. Thank heaven. Someone go get another dying company and turn it around. Then he said to me, I've been there 9 months. I have not accomplished a thing. I said, tell me more. He took the napkin. He drew a little hierarchy. He said, she's doing this. He's doing this. We're doing this with the widgets. I'm not listening to his mouth. I'm listening to his heart. And there's not much there. I said, tell me something. If you went home and held a meeting on Monday, brought in every single employee and said, I have a story to tell you, except it's changed. I don't have this job anymore. I made a phone call. It's gone. For the next 9 months, I'm going to live or die right here. The reason I brought you in this morning is none of you are going to go out that door until we've made some hard decisions. I took a deep breath. I looked up, hoping I wouldn't get punched. He looked at me and said, that's what I've been thinking. And then it gets interesting. He grabbed the napkin and he pulled it back. And he said, she can't stay here. She has to go here. He can't stay at all. He's got to go. We're not going to do this to the widgets. We're going to do this to the widgets. Here's the million-dollar question. Why did the napkin change? 10 seconds ago, it was perfectly acceptable. Now it's radically changed. What happened? The answer is he finally clarified and committed to his purpose. Did he know before he came to Ann Arbor, Michigan, that that woman needed to go to a different place? Answer, yes. Did he know the guy had to go? Yes. Why didn't he do anything? Because you and I prefer to live in our comfort zone, and so did he. Moving the woman is a conflict. Firing the man is a conflict. Changing the widgets is a conflict. All change is conflict. And I'd rather avoid conflict. But the moment I have a higher purpose, a noble purpose, the common good, I have a reason to create conflict. Leaders create conflict. In fact, that's the job of a leader. Your job is to blow up the existing culture from today and make tomorrow better than it was today. And that's inherently conflictual. And anybody who's in their comfort zone is not going to do it. Well, it applies to everything you and I do in life. Second dimension. This is a picture of a man who lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. His name is Roger Newton. Roger brought the world Lipitor, best-selling prescription drug of all time. That's the good cholesterol drug. That means he brought to his company billions of dollars, and he touched the health of millions of people. Roger might as well die, because it's not going to get any better than that, right? Well, Roger made an incredible discovery after bringing forth Lipitor. He discovered that organizations are political. You can write that down if you want. There were people who were threatened by his success, and they began to undermine him. One of the things they did is they began to dissemble his scientific team. The reason that matters, Roger believed Lipitor was not the end, it was the beginning. And it was killing him. One day he was walking across Ann Arbor to the old Borders bookstore, and he was so depressed. In fact, I heard him tell this story to a bunch of scientists, and he said, he looked at them, and he said, well, I was so depressed that I was really depressed, he said. He got to Borders bookstore. On the floor was a pile of books. He didn't see them. He kicked them by accident. They splattered. He picked them up, started piling. Noticed one that was upside down. And on the back it said, "Don't let your company kill you." He says, "That's the book I need." He picked it up, went home and read the book. And on the front it said, "Deep Change, Robert Quinn." My phone rang. He said, "Could we have lunch?" I said, "Sure." We had lunch. He said, "I am your book. I'm in slow death. They're paying me big money to keep my mouth shut. It's killing me. I don't know what to do. I don't have any choices. You know, I could take this team and go start a business, but I can't do that. I'm a scientist. I'm not a businessman. I can't do that." I asked Roger some questions. He said, "Can I come back?" I said, "Sure." About a month later, he came back and we had a 4-hour lunch. He stood up at the end of lunch. He said, "I'm going to do it." He went down State Street, leased a building, started Asperion Therapeutics, and a few years later, he sold it for $1.3 billion. The experiments worked. Roger now asks people a very interesting question when he tells that story. He says, "What if my experiments failed? What if my company was worth zero? What then?" He said, "I didn't believe this then, but I believe it now. Doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that letter at the top of the compass. True north." He says, "The only thing that matters is whether or not we're living our values, whether or not we have integrity." And he says, "Everywhere I turn, I get knocked off of that. That end is what matters." Third dimension. People will say to me, "Quinn, I've got it. You know, purpose-focused, result-centered, and internally directed. I got it. I'm going to go tell my boss just what I think of her." And I said, "Well, that's really good. Are you other-focused? Do you know your boss's deepest needs and interests? Do you love her?" Whoa, they say. Right? In our world, in our problem, whatever it is, there's a scattering of people that make up a network. In that network, do I understand their deepest needs and interests? Most often, the answer I get is no. We did a study of public school teachers. Business school professor could be shot for doing that. You know, why would I do that? We had access to the top 1% of the teachers in Ohio. The things we learned were just incredible. One of them told me a story. She said, "It was really hard for me to get through the ed school for a whole bunch of reasons, but I wanted to teach and I drove myself through. I was much older than the rest of them. I went to my first day of class, 30 little faces looking at me." She said, "This is a long way from the ed school." She said, "I knew that if I was going to be a good teacher, I had to learn the unique needs and interests of every one of those 30 kids. That's hard work, but I chose to do it." She said, "And I became a good teacher." And I'm writing that down. And as I'm writing, she said, "Then I went to the next level." My head shot up. I said, "Next level?" She said, "Yeah, I went to the next level." I said, "What's the next level?" She said, "Well, then I discovered they're all the same." I said, "You just told me they were unique." She said, "They are unique. And they're all the same." See, that's integration and differentiation. Two perspectives melding. She said, "No, catch this key part. No matter what they say or do, comma. No matter what they say or do. Every kid wants to learn. Every kid wants to succeed. Every kid wants to be respected and loved. When you break that code, you can teach anybody. Special ed, gifted, old, young, doesn't matter." Now just think about that. 4th grade teacher. We look down on teachers, right? 4th grade teacher, and she's saying, "I have an unconditional theory of influence. I can go anywhere and succeed." She scaled empathy. She reads feelings individually and collectively. When you do that, you're in a very different place because you're not thinking about yourself. And along with that view is the question, what is the common good? Anybody here married? Anybody here that's married ever have an argument with your spouse? No. That's good. Very peaceful people. I sometimes have arguments with my spouse. I can get quite wrought up. I can take my can of verbal poison and I can throw it on her. And when I do, I always miss something. Between her and me, there's a space. The space is an ecology. When I throw poison, it goes up into that ecology, and then it rains, and who gets wet? I do. I get saturated with my own poison. The moment I say, what is the good of the relationship? Not what's my good, not what's her good. What is the good of the relationship? I instantaneously take my poison and I put it down. Why? Because it's crystal clear to me that throwing poison is a stupid thing to do. That's a transformational question. What is the common good? That's at the heart of this principle. Am I other-focused? Much of the time, I'm selfish. And when I am, I'm blind. I don't see reality. Externally open. When I have authority, it really massages my ego. I get to be the expert, and you have to ask me questions. And I get to tell you what to do. And that's wonderful, I'll be the general. I'll be the mother. I'll be the father. Very interesting possibility is for me to come down there and get on the same level, that is to lower myself, and get my eyes on the same level with your eyes, and create a space between us that's safe, where you can tell the truth. In organizations, truth seldom speaks to power. There are filters all the way up the hierarchy. An amazing thing happens when you and I tell each other the truth. When there's something called trust. It transforms transactional relationships. It transforms hierarchies. Great capacity comes into the system. I had an executive MBA student. At the end of the semester, he said, "I hated your class." I said, "Well, tell me about it." He said, "I knew what those 4 questions meant, and I particularly knew what question number 3 meant. Are you other folks? You know what that means? That means you have to listen." He said, "I hate listening." And this guy ran a bank. He said, "But I had to do your final paper. That meant I had to go do the exercise." So one day I pulled up in front of the bank, and I sat there and said, "Okay, what result do I want to create? Am I other focused?" I said, "Okay, I'm going to listen." He said, I walked into the bank, and the worst thing possible happened. Mary walked up. Mary's this woman that never stopped yapping. I said, "Not Mary, please, not Mary." She came up and she said, "I think we could save money for a little." And I'm trying to listen. And Mary has this surprising idea. I said, "Would you put that on a PowerPoint and bring it to the management meeting?" "Me? Yeah, you." She comes to the meeting. She shows us the idea. Management team says, "Mary, that's incredible. Go do it." "Me? Yeah, go do it." 40% drop in costs in her area. So we called her back in the management meeting, and when she came in, we gave her a standing ovation. He said, "It was the stupidest thing I ever did. Now she never stops. Oh, we can save money on this. We can save money on that." Then he took his glasses off, and he said to me, "Your class changed my life. My bank was full of resources that were invisible. I didn't even know they existed. Everything's changed." The positive lens is all about seeing invisible resources. Because that first list of assumptions on the left makes us blind. By believing what everybody believes, we become blind. And suddenly, he became externally open. And when we're externally open, I can learn from you, no matter what your status is. Not only that, we can co-create a new future. When your brain and my brain are wired together in a relationship of trust, we can do amazing things. Most of the time, we go to meetings that look like this. Ever been to this meeting? You probably went today. What's happening in this meeting? Nothing. We live in those meetings because of the assumptions we make. All right. Now, I want you to study this very simple slide. You are looking at the simplest theory in the history of leadership. If you really study it, you'll see there are no arrows up here. That's impossible. There are no independent, dependent variables. Only 4 questions. Now, if you learn to ask yourself these 4 questions and to answer them, I guarantee you that you can change every situation that's negative into a positive situation. Now, I just made a huge claim. You should be laughing at me right now. These 4 questions give you the power to transform yourself and create positive out of negative. Let me explain how that works. We've had hundreds and hundreds of students and others do this. One of my students ran an IT shop. In 3 months, they made 3 major mistakes. The senior vice president called a meeting. Everybody knew what that meant, right? He said, we walked to that meeting with a big knot in our stomachs. He said, I was so stressed, I thought, well, if there's ever a time to ask the 4 questions, it's now. He said, I stopped, I walked into a corner, I asked the 4 questions, I walked into the room. Now imagine the scene, right? Here's all these people getting ready for this meeting. You know what's going to happen in this meeting. You've been there. What everybody's feeling like. He walks in and he raises his hand. He said, could I start the meeting? Now freeze. Can you see the situation? This is shocking. He's not supposed to do that. Could I start the meeting? Everybody is befuddled. Senior vice president says, I guess so. He says, good. What I want to do is I wanted to tell you in the last 3 months, we've made 3 major mistakes. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is we're not embarrassed. We are absolutely mortified. We're devastated because we love this company. We want it to succeed. And we want to make sure it never happens again. So we've come in here to put ourselves at your feet as your students. And we want you to teach us what we need to do so this never happens again. Freeze. What just happened? Can you see it? This is unheard of. This is insane. The poor vice president is in deep trouble. Why? You know, he came in to give these people a spanking. Now he has to have answers, right? He has to make a contribution. Now, the kid that did that wasn't trying to be a smart aleck. But the moment you ask these 4 questions and answer them, which is the hard part, you immediately become a proactive force. You are no longer a victim. And you're not trying to hurt anybody because you're other focused. You're looking at the common good. The moment you answer the 4 questions, a new strategy comes to you just as it did to him every single time because you've changed the positivity ratio. Once you learn to ask those 4 questions and answer them, you can then, and only then, ask them of other people. And you change their lives. Once you have those 4 questions, you can go into meetings naked. You don't have to have PowerPoint anymore. Those 4 questions will change everything. Now, what I'm saying to you, here's an interesting list that we use all the time. And if you read through it, that's, if you're in a management position, that's next Monday. These are the kinds of experiences that we have all the time. If you're not in a management position, if you're a mom or a dad or doing something else, you still have variations of this. Not in the stomach moments. These are the regularly occurring negative situations that you can turn positive that most people never turn positive. Can you imagine what happens if you're doing that on a regular basis? Can you imagine what happens to an organization where it's being done on a regular basis? All right. Let me conclude and then take some questions. I started out by saying there's an alternative list to the first list we had up, the one that we all have internalized since we were children. That list comes from learning to focus on the right side of the curve, to recognize that excellence exists. We spend all our time solving problems. One of those school teachers said, I've taught this way all my life, but until the last 5 years when these scores came and people started noticing, she said, I've been doing it for 30 years. In 30 years, never once has an administrator from this district ever come into my classroom to see what I was doing. Now, where were the administrators? They were in the other classrooms where the problems are. And that's not just school. That's everywhere. The focus is on the problems. So we can only learn from failure. The moment I put on a more complete lens and see all of reality, I can also simultaneously learn from success. I can spread excellence. We can go look at the examples of excellence that already exist in our system, that everybody says can't exist. There's enormous leverage in that. This model is simple, it's practical, it's based in science. The only downside of this model is it's hard. It requires you and I to take accountability for our own lives. But it opens the door to a world that most people can't imagine. And it can change our relationship with our angry child, our marriage that's failing, our organization that's struggling. All right, I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions because we're at 7 o'clock. Anybody would like to ask a question, feel free. Yes, sir. Sure.
Hello. Is it working? Okay, there we go. Hello. So looking at the graph that, I don't like putting it over. Looking at the graph that you originally had and working your way inward to find that perfect balance, through your research, through the conversation that you've been able to have you ever seen an individual who moved inward in 1 or 2 areas, but not all of them, and seen how that impacted their leadership models or how that impacted their personalities?
That's a great question. We often do an exercise with executives at the end of teaching them this, where we actually have them do it in real time. And they often become frustrated. They find it really hard. And sometimes they'll say, why don't you come do it with so-and-so, because his problem's impossible. And it's not unusual to ask the first question, and they give a lousy answer to what result they want to create. Because there's this answer, the knee-jerk answer. And you often have to help them go underneath that. And I remember trying to help a woman, and she just had a big problem with her husband. I said, what result do you want to create? She said, I want to kill him. Right? Well, that's an answer, but it's not a great answer. and we had to do some work. Well, sometimes it doesn't work on number 1. Sometimes you're on number 3. I was with a guy who was head of sales, and we got to number 3, and 3 he had a really good answer for. And as soon as he answered it, all of a sudden number 1 came in focus. And he later said, you know, that entirely changed my strategy for next week, but it's also changed my life. I get it, right? When you answer one of those questions, the first one creates purpose, the second integrity, the third empathy, and the fourth humility. Those are all virtues. Virtues tend to attract virtues. So the model's not necessarily has to be a one step. It's something you can come at a number of angles. Great question. Thank you. Let's take one more. Yeah.
Given your focus on positive lens
Yeah.
and those fundamental areas of leadership, and the fact that there wasn't as much in the way of research in that particular area, have you found that your research is in conflict with any other part of the business school's teachings? Because there is evidently a lot of areas that are causing a lot of the problems that are existing in the organization.
There's a profound question. Thank you. The answer is absolutely. At Michigan, our last dean did a strategic analysis of what were the unique strengths of the Ross Business School. And the committee came back with 4 pillars, they called them, that were uniquely Ross. The third one was positive, because we had this whole cadre of researchers working together. That's pretty unique for them to work on one concept. And this whole thing had built up. There were many books, papers. They said, this is a unique function of Ross. Ross needs to build around this pillar. The other 3 were interdisciplinary, rigorous, and action learning, none of which were unique to Ross. Those 3 were fine. Half the faculty went berserk around the notion of the positive pillar. They said, that's not business. And they're right, it's not. Right? Business is a transaction. You're a unit, you're an object, we use you. That's good economics. It makes people really uncomfortable. Now the interesting thing is, when you internalize the positive lens, you do not lose your old lens. You can still do problem solving. You just became more powerful because you have more choices. You lose nothing, you just grow. That's also almost incomprehensible to people who are very afraid when their status is dependent on their expertise. It's all about being smart. Well, it turns out that's not true. And we absolutely worship that statement. It's all about being smart. It's about being smart and being good. That's incomprehensible. Thank you for a wonderful question. All right, I think with that we should probably take our break and take the next step.
Thank you, Professor Quinn. Thank you for giving us insights, wisdom, and hope. Please join me in another round of applause. This concludes the public portion of tonight's program, and all of us at the Houndstein Center and its Cook Leadership Academy want to say thank you to everyone here. We are always grateful for your attendance and your role in forming a community that cares about leadership and common ground. Although Grand Valley's official graduation isn't happening until later this weekend, the Houndstein Center isn't quite done with events this year. Please note the events that are listed on our website. We have 2 fantastic programs coming up. In the beginning of May is the Houndstein Center Hidden Wounds of War Conference. Additionally, in early June, our 4th annual Midwestern History Conference. At this time, we'll be taking a brief break so that we can transition from this public program to our private CLA graduation. I would like to remind the following groups to please stay close as we will begin our graduation ceremony in 10 minutes. The following groups are our Cook Leadership Academy Fellows, mentors, alumni, and your invited guests, as well as our Houndstein Center donors and members. CLA graduates, we ask that you line up against this wall in alphabetical order during our break. Again, thank you for attending tonight's Wheelhouse Talk. We hope to see you at more of our events soon. Have a wonderful evening.